and this is Tile. So let's hope that doesn't happen again. Hello everyone, welcome back. My name is Bella, if you don't know who I am. And if you didn't read the title of this video, today I'm going to be doing a video on my favorite historical fiction books as a history major. So if you don't know, I study history at the University of Toronto, as well as European affairs. But yeah, I've always loved historical fiction novels. They've always been my favorite. I've read a lot over my lifetime, and I feel like I do have some authority in saying what are good ones or giving you guys recommendations. Oh, as you may learn from this video, the way I view historical fiction is probably not entirely accurate. When I talk about historical fiction, I also just mean books that are set in the past and that really explore the life of that time. I don't really know, so whatever, don't come for me if you're like, that book isn't historical fiction, because I will be like, well, it's set in the past and it kind of is centered around a historical event, and so I consider it historical fiction. So anyways, let's get into it. So the first category I'm gonna do is my books that were originally written in Spanish. So that's kind of like a broad category, I know, but I don't want to ruffle anybody's freaking feathers because you know how people on the internet get ruffled. So these are all books that were originally written in Spanish. They were written by either Latin American authors or a Spanish author. So my first recommendation, which I have discussed in my other book video, is Love in the Time of Cholera by Gabriel García Márquez. It's set in Colombia. I don't really know exactly when it's set, but it is set in the 20th century, but I think it's like the early 20th century. But yes, this is a romance story. This is about unrequited love, and it follows two characters over 52 years, something like that. And it's incredible. And the author is Latino, or was. I think he might be dead. Not sure. My second, well, okay. So these three books are written by Isabel Allende. She is a Chilean author. She is still alive. I know this for a fact because this book came out like a year or two ago. Yeah. So my first rec from her, I've only read 3 of her books and all 3 of them I've loved. So do with that what you will. This is A Long Petal of the Sea, and this follows the life of 2 Spanish immigrants who leave during the 1930s, the Civil War in Spain that went on, and they moved to Chile. So the book is set in Spain. A little bit of it is set in France, because that's where a lot of Spanish refugees fled to during the Civil War. And then they leave from France, I believe, to go to Chile and start new lives. And it has love in it. It has a love story, but it's sort of like a sadder love story. One of the main characters, she is a pregnant young widow, and then the other one is the brother of her husband. Basically, she and her husband's brother, flee Spain together, and they start their new lives in Chile, and they raise her son as his own. It's more about platonic love. I found that it was more of like a platonic love. It was a really fascinating book, especially if you want to read a story about like an immigrant story. I find these type of stories fascinating because my grandparents were immigrants, all of them. And then another book by Isabel Allende is The House of Spirits. This story, in a very Latin American style, follows a clan, a whole family, and it follows 3 generations of this one family. And I really this book was an adventure, I have to tell you, because there were so many characters, there was so much, there was always so much going on, there was so, it just kept me so engaged, and the characters were just unbelievably interesting. It is set in Latin America. So with Isabel Allende, I find that she often doesn't name the countries, except for along Petal to the Sea. She actually did like say that it was Chile, but with a lot of her other fiction, even this book, she doesn't name the country. Pretty much every country in Latin America was a dictatorship at one point in the 20th century, and often that was helped by the United States. The CIA often intervened in Latin America because it's America's backyard. Anyways, I did a whole Latin American history course, and I definitely think Isabel Allende is giving a commentary on kind of the state of her region by leaving the countries unnamed in most of her novels, because the experience of these characters was shared by the region, and it was not just one country's problem, it was across the region. And yeah, I don't know how coherent that was, but this book was so cool. And there was a dog in this book. I don't know why that detail stuck out to me, but there was like a dog, and oh my god, it was so cute. One of my favorite things about novels, and it will make me sob my eyes out, is when the last line of the book is the exact same as the first line of the book, and that happens in this book. And so I was like on the ground in tears. And my final recommendation by Isabel Allende is Of Love and Shadows. So I got this book for my 19th birthday. My boyfriend bought me this book. We went book shopping together on my birthday, and this was the book I picked out, and I loved it. So this is another novel set in an unnamed Latin American country that is under the control of a military dictatorship, and it follows, so this one is very much a love story. It follows this upper class woman who is a journalist, and then it also follows this guy who is the son of a Marxist professor. So it's very interesting, and they are reporting on a crime, and that was done by the police, and they're kind of investigating the crime together, and they're friends, and then they like fall in love. So I'm like, yes, good. I'm like, good, as you should. Yeah, my final recommendation is The Shadow of the Wind. The original title of this book is El Sombre del Viento, something like that. It is set in 1945 in Barcelona, and it follows this little boy. Well, I guess he's not a little boy, he's like a teenager. His name is Daniel, and he and his dad own a bookshop together. And Daniel finds this book called The Shadow of the Wind, and he kind of undergoes this like quest to find who the author is and what happened to the author. So it's kind of two storylines, you could say, because it follows Daniel in like the present, so 1945. He's like trying to figure out this book and like the mysteries around it, but then it also follows the author, Julian Carax, and it's set in like 1910, and it follows two love stories. So Daniel has his own love story, and then there's like the love story of the author of the book that Daniel is like figuring out. And there's also a mystery. This is very like gothic mystery vibes, Barcelona, like the way that Zafón sets it. It's very like dark, somber. Is that the word in English? Somber. And it's also obviously following World War II, and like there's the dictatorship of Franco going on in Spain right now. So yes, it follows an epic story of murder, madness, and doomed love. I love that shit. I love that shit. There were some quotes that really hit the soul, especially this one. I have it bookmarked and highlighted. This is beautiful. All I wish is for you to be happy, Julian, so that everything you aspire to achieve may come true, and that, although you may forget me in the course of time, one day you may finally understand how much I loved you. Like, think about that. This is masterfully written. I love this book, and I read this book in Spanish, and it's very good in Spanish as well, obviously. So read it in English or Spanish, but The Shadow of the Wind is an incredible book. Now we're gonna get to the chonkiest section. So you can feel free to skip this section if you really hate books like this. But for me, give me a good World War II book. I'm hooked. I'm literally hooked. So we have this stack. Some of you may recognize some of these titles, and some of you maybe do not. But my first recommendation is Codename Verity by Elizabeth Wein or Wein. I'm sorry, I know it's like German or something. I cannot pronounce that. It follows this spy, and her name is Verity, which I think is a really cool name. And she chose this spy name for herself because it is a play on the French word for truth, vérité. So yeah, Verity. Yeah, it's about this spy, and she's captured by the Nazis and she's being tortured. And then it also follows like the story before she's being tortured. So if you don't want to read about torture or violence, don't read this book, because there is a lot of violence in this book, but it's also really well written and a really unique story, I would say, because a lot of World War II books, as I said, I've read many of them. I've never really read one that was like this one. This is very well written and I recommend. Secondly, we have All the Light We Cannot See. So I read this book probably 2 years ago, maybe 3. I want to reread it actually because I'm going to France for like 2 days this summer, and I really just want to read a book set in Paris, set in France. So this book follows 2 separate characters. This girl who is blind, who lives in Paris with her father, and then the war begins, World War II begins, and they flee Paris because it's being like bombed and the Nazis are invading, yada yada. They flee to this place called Saint-Malo, which is a walled, they call it a walled citadel. If you know what that is, it's like a walled in city basically. Some medieval times type shit. So it follows like the blind girl and her kind of like story through the war and how she survives, and she's French. And then it follows this German orphan boy. He has to join the German army. He does eventually see like conflict and he does fight in the war. But yeah, both of these guys are the same age and then their stories intersect and it's very cool. But honestly, I don't remember many details about this book. But I think the setting was what really stuck with me because Saint-Malo is like a really cool little place. Like you guys should Google it. It's in France. I think it's in Normandy, but I'm probably wrong about that. Thirdly, we have The Book Thief by Márquez. This follows a young girl named Liesel. She's fostered by this older couple. It kind of gives Anne of Green Gables vibes. And they harbor a Jewish person who is hiding from the Nazis. And Liesel befriends him. And it's a really, really good book. Like everybody knows what this book is. Many people have read this book. I'm sure you didn't need me to like explain it. Okay, so these next 3 books are written by the same author because I love her. She is a masterful writing goddess. Kate Quinn. Ugh, she's incredible. Okay, so these are 3 of her books that I have. So you guys may know Kate Quinn for writing the Alice Network, but she's also written 2 books. Well, these 3 books are less discussed, and I don't know why, because the Alice Network is incredible, but these are also incredible. So firstly, The Rose Code. This follows the story of a woman who works at Bletchley Park in England. So it's set in England, and this woman works in the place where they're trying to crack the codes of the like Nazi machines. What were they called? If you guys have ever seen The Imitation Game, this is set in the same place as The Imitation Game, and this girl is like working on what Alan Turing was kind of doing, I think. Yeah, they're working on what's called the bomb machines, bomb with an E, and they're code breakers. The main character is a code breaker, and it's a really cool story. I think this is one of Kate Quinn's first books. I read this in high school and I did my ISU on this book. If you guys went to high school in Ontario, you might know what an ISU was. I did my English ISU in grade 11 or grade 10 on this book. And this was so good. This followed multiple characters, including this one Russian girl named Nina, who joins the Night Witches, which was an all-female bombing squad in the Soviet army. And then it also follows like a war correspondent, and then it follows like the 17-year-old girl. All the characters come together, like all the storylines come together. It has a lot of storylines, so if you like those type of books where there's a lot of different characters, there's a lot of different storylines that like come together and mash up, so good. And all of the characters are hunting for this female assassin called the Huntress who worked for the Nazis. My final recommendation from Kate Quinn is The Diamond Eye. This is her newest book, I believe. I got it for Christmas of last year, so Christmas 2022. And this follows this I believe is a true story. It follows this history student, this girl named Mila. She's Ukrainian, I think. And she joins the Soviet army and she becomes one of the most successful snipers in the army. Yeah. And because she's a woman and she's quite young, she has to go on this publicity tour basically to the United States, and she meets with like Eleanor Roosevelt and stuff, and then somebody's trying to kill her, basically. Yeah. It was a good book. And because it was a true story, I don't know, I felt more connected to the character. Her name was Mila Pavlichenko. Great book. My last historical fiction rec is Daughter of the Reich by Louise Fien. God, what are these names with the E-I-N? Okay, I really liked this book. I haven't read it in years. Basically, it's about this teenage girl named Hetty, and her father is a high-ranking Nazi official, and she falls in love with her best friend who is Jewish, this Jewish kid named Walter, and they have like a secret love affair, and then they plan a life together, and they're gonna escape Germany, but then there's like things that happen. But yeah, when I tell you I cried. This is a really good book. And I never have ever heard anybody else who has recommended this book before in my life. So yeah, I really love this book, Daughter of the Reich. Great. My next historical fiction recs are, again, still set in Europe, but these are not World War II, okay? So I'm giving you some diversity here. So these two books that I'll start with are both set in Italy. I've already recommended this in another video. It's called The Florios of Sicily. It's set in the early 1800s. Yeah, like the first couple decades of the 1800s, and it's set in Sicily, and it follows like a family, and also there's like a lot of geopolitical stuff going on in Italy at the time. This is a really good book. I really loved it and highly recommend. And then this book, ooh, woo-wee. I got this book for Christmas. It is The Marriage Portrait by Maggie O'Farrell. Guys, this book. The only thing I don't like about this book is that it was $35. You see how thin this is? What am I paying for? So that you can have this portrait on the cover, because it is a real portrait, in some museum somewhere in Florence probably. I don't know. I loved this book. Ooh. It follows this young duchess named Lucrezia de Medici. It's set in Florence in the 1550s. Lucrezia, the main character, is the third daughter of the Grand Duke of Florence, of the Medici family. Her older sister is meant to marry this Duke of Ferrara, But then her older sister dies, and so she has to marry this guy instead, even though she's really young, and it's kind of like gross. She's like 14 or 15. So she has to leave her home and her big family in Florence, and she goes to live in the court of her new husband, the Duke of Ferrara. And bad things happen to her. Her husband is a horrible person, and the ending is, yeah, she basically has to fight for her survival. And then her portrait is being taken as like her life kind of falls apart. This book was good. This was a solid 4 out of 5 stars. Okay, and then my last 3 RECS set in Europe are The Pillars of the Earth trilogy, written by my Lord and Savior, Ken Follett. I love this man. I would do anything for this man. Ken has my heart. Ken, if you're watching, you're a G, and I love you. So, The Pillars of the Earth. So the whole series, each book is like a century or a couple centuries apart. So it's obviously not the same characters that it follows, but all 3 of these books are set in the same town in England called Kingsbridge, and it follows the evolution of the town, essentially. This is the OG, The Pillars of the Earth. This book is, I think, 1,000 pages long, just over 1,000 pages. And it's a little beat up. She's a little worse for wear, but she's traveled all around Europe, and now she's in Canada, and she goes to university with me. So that's why. It's set in this town, as I said, called Kingsbridge. And The Pillars of the Earth follows multiple characters. It follows this guy, Philip, who's the prior of Kingsbridge, and he wants to build a really beautiful cathedral in his town. So he hires this guy, Tom. Tom is another one of the main characters, and he's a mason who becomes the architect of this cathedral. And then there's also Lady Aliena, and she is a noblewoman who, like, bad things happen to her, and so she, like, yeah. Oh, it's so good. So it's described as a spellbinding epic tale of ambition, anarchy, and absolute power, set against the sprawling medieval canvas of 12th century England. This book, guys, such a good book. Then we have the second book in the series, World Without End. This book is also over 1,000 pages. This one is actually a little bit longer than Pillars of the Earth. This book is like 200 pages longer. So this book is set in 1327, and then for a couple like decades after. So this book is set in the 12th century. This one is set in the 14th century, also set in Kingsbridge. And it follows these 4 children who witness something on Halloween. And that kind of sets the trajectory of their lives. And like, the stories that come together, there's twists and turns, and their adult lives just are like entwined with one another. Yeah. My only complaint about, okay, the love story in this one is incredible, but I prefer the love story in this one, if I'm being honest. My boyfriend disagrees. He prefers the love story between Aliena and her mans. I prefer the love story with these characters. Myrthen. Oh yeah, I'm really bad with specifics. If you cannot tell, I'm horrible with specifics. I have read all of these books. Most of these books I've read more than once, and I could not tell you like main character names often. Karis are the main characters who have their love story in this. And then, okay, yeah. This is the 3rd book in the series, A Column of Fire. This one was good. This is some good. Also, because these books are like 1,000 pages long, they're historical fiction. Poor Ken takes years and years and years and years to write these books. Can you imagine? But also, I would really love to be on his research team. This one, the third book in the series, is set in 1558 and then the decades after. So as you can see, it's like 200 years apart in each book. It's also set in Kingsbridge. Oh, and this is the era of when England was going through a lot of turmoil because there was the Catholics and the Protestants were fighting each other. This book is also set in France for a lot of it, in Paris. Yeah. This was really, really, really freaking good. But this one leaned more towards history than it did like a story. These ones were very much centered around the characters. Like I don't know how to explain this. I feel as though the first two were centered around the characters and like the backdrop was the things that were going on, like the geopolitical stuff going on. This book was a story about the geopolitical conflicts that were going on and like the internal conflicts, and then it was like the characters were more of an afterthought. So I feel like the characters were less developed in this book, but maybe that's an unfair characterization. I don't know. I found this book so interesting. These books, I loved them. I loved the story. This one was interesting. Can you kind of see the difference? Yeah. So, Ken Follett. My next recommendations are books set in America. I think that's the way I'm gonna phrase it, okay? These are books set in the United States of America. And I don't even know if some of these are considered historical fiction, but I'm gonna consider them historical fiction. You can be like, whatever, that's your prerogative. So this is Gone with the Wind. So this book is set in the South, and it's set during the Civil War and during the Reconstruction era. It follows this character, Scarlett O'Hara. She is a rich white woman. Her family owns a plantation, although I don't know if they call it a plantation in this book. I really only like this book because of the love story. She falls in love with this other guy, Rhett Butler. But I mean, it is interesting to see kind of like a different perspective to the American Civil War. But the author of this book, I think, was also against the Union. Yeah, it's kind of controversial. It has always been controversial, apparently. So yeah, that's what I'm gonna say on Gone with the Wind. Secondly, I have the Book of Negros by Lawrence Hill. And this is one of the best books I've ever read in my life. I believe Lawrence Hill is Canadian, and he's written a lot of really, really fantastic historical fiction. So this book follows the life of a young girl from a West African nation, and it's unnamed, they don't say. Her name is Aminata, and she gets abducted when she's 11 from her village. She gets sold into slavery. She survives the transatlantic passage. She becomes a slave in the United States in the South, and it follows her entire life. It's basically her narrating her own life, but this is fiction. This is not a real person. My copy is special because it has illustrations and like maps and documents and things. Because although this is a fictional story, it is historical fiction. So it, like, elements of it are obviously taken directly from history, and follows the life that other real people underwent. Okay, apparently The Little Women is not considered historical fiction. I consider it historical fiction, so I'm going to be recommending this book. I love this book. This is also a book set in the American Civil War, just like Gone with the Wind, except Louisa May Alcott is less problematic, and yeah, the movie, the 2019 Little Women movie is one of my favorite movies of all time, with Timothy Chalamet, Saoirse Ronan, Emma Watson, like our beloved people. The book is so wholesome. This book is kind of a Christmas book because it's set in Christmas time for a lot of it, or like in winter time. So I read this over Christmas like 2 years ago, and it was so cute, so wholesome. And then you also have like the Civil War going on in the backdrop. But really, like, this story, they're kind of privileged because they don't, like, the Civil War isn't on their doorstep. They never actually like experience the realities of war. It's just like their father is like off being a doctor in the war, or no, their father is a pastor or something, I don't know, but he's in the Union Army. And then the last book I recommend, again, is this historical fiction? Because I consider this to be historical fiction, but I don't think it is. I don't know. To Kill a Mockingbird. This is apparently a first edition copy. My grandma got it for me. I don't know where she found it. She either had it or she found it. But the font that they used is literally beautiful. I've loved this book since I was a kid. Just the story is very, I don't know, the story's like, it's unique, it's really interesting. So the main characters are these little kids, and their dad is a lawyer. These kids are white, their dad is white. They live in the South, they live in Alabama. Their dad ends up defending a black man in like this trial. And this book explores like racism. Kind of just an interesting look into life in the American South in like the 1920s or 1930s. Not sure exactly when this is set. Okay, my last category is the Middle East and India. I don't even know how to like categorize these. I told you guys I only really read historical fiction that is like set in Europe or centered around European conflicts, which is why I study European affairs, because I'm interested in European history and European politics and such European stuff. But these two books are incredible. So firstly, we have The Kite Runner by Khaled Hosseini. And this book is set in Afghanistan. And it follows two kids, Amir and Hassan. And they come from different worlds because Amir comes from a rich family, and then Hassan is like the servant of Amir, and his parents are servants for Amir's family, but they become best friends. And Amir witnesses Hassan being attacked, and he does nothing. And so that choice haunts him for the rest of his life. It's set during kind of like, set over a couple of decades in Afghanistan, in Kabul. And it's sort of like, you see the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan, and then I think it ends sort of when America invades Afghanistan. So I would say with this book, the trigger warning is there's sexual assault, and also like war, violence. Amir ends up in the United States because he has to flee Afghanistan because of like the war, but he was one of the lucky ones who actually got to flee. I actually read this in grade 10 English class. Every book written by Khaled Hosseini is really well written. He has written a lot of stories set in Afghanistan that explore the tragedies that have happened in that country. So yeah, if you want to read books about Afghanistan written by an Afghani person, I would recommend his books. My final recommendation is The Henna Artist by Alka Joshi. I was given this for Christmas a couple years ago, and I only just got around to reading it like a month ago. this follows this young woman who is a henna artist. It's set after independence, like right after independence. And she basically fled her village. Her name is Lakshmi. So she fled her village and her abusive marriage. She was married off when she was young, like a young teenager. And so she fled her village and her abusive husband. She ran away to Jaipur, a city in India, and she became a henna artist to survive. So the girl, Lakshmi, she finds out that she has a younger sister that she knew nothing about. She takes her younger sister in, and yeah, there's things that go on. It's a really beautiful story about this young woman trying to build her own life, which is quite hard when you're on your own and in a city where you don't have any family. And then she has to suddenly raise a sister that she didn't know she had. Yeah, it's a really good story. I'm tired from talking. But yeah, this is everything for today. I hope you enjoyed this video, and I will see you guys in the next one. Bye!